Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just can I have your attention, please, for a moment before we start the authority meeting? Just to take note that silence to be observed, please. Just the speakers, and can everyone please switch off their mobile phones? And that this, as usual, will be recorded and streamed live. So just put your phones, either switch them off completely or put them on airplane mode. Thanks very much. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Helen. Díomh Chorja agus bhórgéad fáilte ríist go dtí an cruinniú seo an céad cruinniú peibli an údras pólíneachta san bhliain seo. Agus I dús ama bachór agus is ceart agus níor bhiste. A hantas sa thuairt an cinenne óg an rialtas an teachtain Síochána sílim. Cur le tréimhse ifige an Commissioner Drew Harris agus gan áras fáil tíimiid ribh an cinenne sin agus tréis líimiid a gradam dó. You're welcome to this first public meeting of the Policing Authority in 2022. And it's proper that we mark the fact that last week the government decided to extend the term of Commissioner Harris until September 2025, and the authority warmly welcomes that decision, and we wish you, as you know, we wish you very, very well in the coming years. It was a good decision and good that it was taken at this time. At the last authority meeting, which was in January, but a private meeting, there was an extensive discussion between the authority and the Commissioner and his colleagues on violence against women. It is, of course, more properly, I suppose, gender-based violence, but the focus was very definitely violence against women in the context of recent events at that time, in the context of the body of evidence that the authority has addressed frequently over the last number of years on this specific topic. And given the extent of the public response, the community response, and very specifically the response of women to the issue of violence directed against them and to the issue of securing their safety within our community. The discussion was a very productive one, very open, very encouraging on a whole variety of bases, and we thought it right that we should address this topic again at this meeting, but in the context of its being in public. And so I'm going to ask Debbie Donnelly, Authority Member, to lead on this topic.
Thanks, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Isn't it wonderful to be able to meet in person again? Commissioner, you will understand the reassurance that many women seek. And whilst the Garda Síochána are not the only contributors to public safety, they're a major contributor to how us as a population and women feel unsafe. Can you provide some reassurance to women about your contribution to their perception of safety, both in the public sphere and in the private sphere? And maybe when you're doing that, you could maybe comment on the lessons learned and where you are following Operation Fuishiv, and the additional reassurance that victims of domestic violence should have in you, and the lessons learned.
Thank you very much, Debbie. This is obviously an exceptionally important topic, a topic that we have taken seriously over recent years. We've seen that in terms of our investment in our own protective services unit, both nationally and then at the divisional level as well, in terms of successful investigations and prosecutions around coercive control, and also then our outreach during the pandemic and Operation Fuishiv. So There are a number of elements to this, and if I look to my colleagues then, in terms just we can give, I think, a greater understanding around domestic abuse and the research that we've done through Pulse, where we now have the victim-offender relationship and what that shows to us. Our recent work then as well in terms of the evaluation of Operation Síochána, and I'll look to John and Colm in respect of that as well. And then I'd look to Síochána in respect of the strategy we want to develop around violence or gender-based violence, and also what more we can do within the organisation as well to make sure that it is seen to be a safe place for women and indeed those who might feel threatened within Garda Síochána. So there's a lot both externally in terms of the policing service that we provide, but also internally in terms of the culture within Garda Síochána, which is very important in respect of this. And lastly, from my point before I hand over to my colleagues, we also recognise how critical this has been as an issue right across the world and for other police services as well. And we want to learn from what they're doing. We want to learn, obviously, from what they're doing well, but also we want to avoid some of the mistakes that have happened as well. And so I think we're well placed to give reassurance both externally but also internally. So if I turn first just to Anne-Marie, and then Anne-Marie then lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good afternoon, everybody. So I suppose just following on from what the Commissioner has just said, we're continuously using the information that we have recorded on Pulse to try and get a better understanding of what that information and that data is actually telling us. And I suppose to the fore in that in recent times has been our capacity to record the victim-offender relationship, which has only been in being since July this year. But already it has yielded very, very valuable, rich information that will allow us to target our response accordingly, and also to get a greater understanding in terms of where the vulnerable groups are and I suppose the categories within that also give us a really, really deep understanding. And in that regard, I'm going to ask Andrew O'Sullivan now to take us to a presentation which I think is very powerful in terms of what it is saying to us. So Andrew, please.
Okay, thanks, Deputy. So as the Deputy said there, we are constantly refining the way that we use data to get further insights into domestic violence and into gender-based violence. So one of the changes that we introduced back last July was the tracking of the relationship between victims and offenders explicitly as a variable on Pulse. So we have 12 categories that we're tracking. We're already actually refining that, so that blood relative, for example, we're going to refine that to interfamilial relationships. But even with the data that we have so far, even after just 6 months or so of collecting it, we can see, if you can make out on the screen there, that violence between intimate partners is very much a factor in both assaults that cause harm and also in minor assaults. But it's really only from when that's combined then and overlaid with a combination of domestic abuse incidents that the trend really becomes apparent. And obviously the overwhelming number of victims in domestic abuse cases are female. It happens to males as well, but the majority are female. And in that case, what we see is that there are 3 categories that absolutely dominate it, and it's also interesting that that's the same pattern right the way across the country, that it's the relationship between intimate partners, former intimate partners, and blood relatives, which, as we said, we're going to refine that to be, that's really a familial relationship, so we'll be changing that label a little bit. But the other key thing, I suppose, about that is that pattern changes quite a bit when it's crime incidents excluding domestic abuse. So there's a very particular pattern in domestic abuse about the nature of the relationship between the victim and the offender. And generally, there's a different pattern between males and females and how they experience assaults. In the case of women, it's almost exclusively, again, when you look at all assaults, because most of them tend to happen in that domestic setting, it's across almost the same three categories. So when you look at all assaults against women, it's almost exactly the same pattern as for domestic abuse. That it's those three categories of relationship that drive the violence and drive the assaults. It's slightly different for men, quite different for men actually, in that it's still a factor where the blood relatives are involved, or there's familial violence. But the overwhelming set of cases for men is where the offender is unknown to them, and it's that kind of unexpected, I suppose, attack or violence. And in the case of women, it's almost exclusively those three categories that are driving it. So that's going to be a very major part, I suppose, of our strategy going forward, is that it ties in very closely, obviously, the notion of gender-based violence, not perhaps unexpectedly, but at least now we have very tight evidence of exactly how it's happening. The other important thing about this victim-offender relationship is that that not all of these necessarily are crimes. They don't meet the threshold of crimes, but they do meet the threshold for recording for us where there's domestic disputes, but no offence disclosed. And the recording of those also is extremely important to us, because that allows us to build up a pattern of behaviour, because by the time a victim feels able to report the crime, there's probably has been a pattern of criminality perhaps even over a number of years before it even gets to the threshold of a crime. So we're also going to be putting effort into, in conjunction with the Protective Services Unit, into looking how we can predict patterns of behaviour from both serial offenders, and unfortunately there's also a pattern of victims that tend to be serial victims almost, I suppose, without obviously attributing any blame to them. The victim-offender relationship was introduced, as we said, back in July. Our main motivation for doing it was to make sure that we didn't miss any cases. So as you can imagine, by tracking the relationship between the victim and the offender, it allows us to hoover up any remaining cases. And we were very pleasantly surprised in some way, I suppose, but it was great to see that in 95% of cases, the recording actually was already correct. So that the guards and the investigators already knew that this was a domestic abuse case, and it's only in the remaining 5% of cases that it wasn't picked. It was still investigated as a crime. It was still the victim was still fully supported, but it wasn't recorded as a domestic abuse case. And just to give you some insight into the operational impact that Chief Noonan and his team from Protective Services are getting from this is it's the nuances, it's the last few of those domestic abuse cases perhaps that wouldn't be normally regarded as traditional domestic abuse, if there is such a thing. So that includes cases where forgery or false documents were used to inflict emotional abuse on family members, and it's really only by looking at, when you combine the relationship between them, and then you look at the nature of the offence that comes to light. And then similarly, there was blackmail and extortion cases, which again wouldn't normally fit the pattern. They may not even have happened in a family home, but they still count as domestic abuse in terms of the way that they happen. So this operational impact, I'm sure Chief Noonan will comment on it as well, allows us to go that kind of final step, and we're extremely confident now, I guess, that we have very strong recording of domestic abuses, so that when they're reported to us, and then that recording and the quality of that data will allow us both to spot these last few remaining cases, but then also to start to build up patterns of behaviour as to how domestic abuse develops, because increasingly it's going to be a case of intervening early rather than, again, waiting for that crime to happen, which could be years down the line, obviously, after a period of abuse. So that's just an overview of some of the data changes we're making. This is just one part of a thematic review that we're developing on gender-based violence, which we hope to publish during March, but that's just one new piece of it that we thought we'd highlight today. So, thanks.
So, in part of the question was in relation to lessons learned from Operation Fuishiv. So, I suppose I'll come to Chief Noonan in a minute, but I suppose at a high level, one of the key learnings from Operation Fuishiv is the importance of going back and re-looking and re-engaging with the various victims, and that has been the strength. And throughout COVID, we've I would say that we have helped and saved a lot of victims from further violence. So, Chief Noonan, perhaps you might just take us through some of the other learnings.
Thank you, Commissioner. The aim of Operation Freeze-Up is important to remember here, and it's where we started, and it was to provide an enhanced support measures and a proactive measures to victims of domestic abuse. And I think we have had 5 phases of Operation Freeze-Up, and they have resulted, and there are some interesting statistics. We responded to over 48,000 calls to domestic abuse incidents, 10% increase. Out of that, there were over 4,200 breaches of domestic violence acts. So orders that were issued under the Domestic Violence Act. There was over 4,200 of those. And significantly, there was over 8,600 charges preferred. So they're the empirical results of what Operation Freeze-Up delivered. And how we're trying to build that into how Garda Síochána addresses domestic, sexual and gender-based violence really is tied around the key focuses that are being set out, that have been set out by the Minister for Justice in the 3rd National Strategy. So it's incorporating the elements within that where Garda Síochána will take the lead into a brand new domestic abuse strategy for Garda Síochána and a brand new implementation, how we implement our domestic abuse policies and our guidelines. That's something we're at the final stages of delivering at present, and that will shift, I think, how Garda Síochána and significantly its operational members view the vulnerability of domestic abuse victims.
And what will that mean for women who need your help?
I think the key message from our perspective is that we're there to listen. We are listening, but we need to understand how vulnerable domestic abuse victims are. And that understanding is key to sell, I think, to our operational members. And in every single briefing and in every single training opportunity, that's the message that's there, that victims are vulnerable and you need to listen and you need to believe and you need to act. And I think a key figure is that 92% of our operational members have successfully completed the domestic abuse training. They're aware that that's our key message. We have our protective services units in every single division in Garda Síochána now. Over 392 people who are out there investigating serious sexual investigations, serious domestic abuse investigations. But it is primarily a frontline response. Our members who are out there every day and every night are dealing with victims of domestic abuse, so they need to understand that vulnerability.
And what about the callbacks that was so successful element of Operation Freeze-Up?
And that's the key that Andrew has identified in the victim-offender relationship, because the implication of recording a victim-offender relationship and onwards recording a domestic abuse motive for that incident is that the callback process kicks in, because that incident is now categorised as a domestic abuse incident. And the victim callbacks process kicks in. The monitoring around that victim as a vulnerable person kicks in directly from that.
At the last meeting, we were invited to think about an overarching strategy in respect of gender-based violence, and we had been thinking about that when also we've been thinking about internally what the culture of the organisation should be, so that one, we supported obviously women within the organisation, but also then to give reassurance to victims who would report to Garda Síochána to get a quality service, and as the Chief Super has outlined, that they could be assured of the service that we would provide, and that would be victim focused. So if I could turn to the Deputy, Síochána, just to outline the work she's undertaken at the moment in respect of that, please.
And so we know that what happens in society is also reflected of what happens within Garda Síochána. So as we move on what we're doing with respect to community, we're also looking within the organisation. So a few of the things that have happened since we met last, an email went out from the Commissioner to every member and every staff of Garda Síochána talking about this issue and encouraging those who may be victims of domestic violence to come forward, as well as where they can go to get support. And so I think this is really important, because I believe that's actually the first time that you'd sent an email out to every member of the organisation. At the same time, internally, we're doing a review of our professional standards cases, and that includes both the ones that we have through our internal affairs as well as what GSOC has, just to make sure that our service delivery with respect to how those cases have been conducted is up to par. In addition to that, I went with Acting Executive Director Yvonne Cook on Monday to the UK. We went to London and we met with 2 different police services there and looked at their program around this issue, because police services internationally are really looking at how to deal with this issue, and we want to make sure that anything that we're doing is up to international best practices. And in fact, I can tell you that some of the things we shared were things that were seen as learnings for other police agencies as well, and I was quite proud of that. And as a result of that, on this Monday, I've been invited to come together with leaders from 7 different international police services on this issue, again, to look at very specific things that are being done and how what we're doing compares, and so that we can continue to learn from each other. And so I see this as part of trying to develop a broader community of practice in this space, because I think the things that have happened in the last couple of months in particular have really shown, as we come out of COVID, how significant an issue that this is, and it's a watershed moment, if you will. And so everybody is thinking about it, and it's an opportunity to come together and to see how we can get to where we want to be, so that no one has to go through this. And so even above and beyond the 7 police agencies, I've also reached out to another international police agency in addition to that, to invite them to work with us as part of a broader community of practice. And they've agreed because in addition to us, they're also working on it. So it seems everyone across the board is really looking at this important issue. And the last thing I just wanted to mention, it was in the paper today. You might have heard about an article that was written with respect to a pilot that Garda Síochána is doing with respect to unconscious bias. And so this is a program that's using artificial intelligence and a gaming program, but it specifically looks at both gender and cultural awareness. And so it would allow anyone who is using the training to actually understand where their own biases are and then work to improve those areas. And so I think it's a training opportunity like no other, and it's come out of our human rights area, and it actually builds on the work that's been done with the Human Rights Champion. More than 1,000 people within the organization have taken the course through the University of Limerick. However, this particular program that I'm talking about is actually being done through Trinity College, and it's being done for those who are about to be deployed on peacekeeping missions. That is where the opportunity begins, and then once we see how that unfolds, we can decide whether or not to continue it and where it can be taken later. But again, it's a best practice that I don't think anyone else in the world is doing, other than Seattle Police, because we're the 2 to pilot it. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. I think other colleagues may have other questions, but maybe at some stage this afternoon you will address in a little bit more detail some of the internal considerations and the standards that you expect of your own officers, and say to us or tell us a little bit about the expectations of and how to you deal with officers who have barring orders or some sort of orders as well, some stage this afternoon. Okay, but in the meantime,
well,
are you dealing?
Maybe Sean could talk to this now, because that's a very, very important area as well.
So there's kind of 2 pieces to it. One is with respect to those who are being, they're facing disciplinary proceedings with respect to gender-based violence themselves. We're certainly dealing with that, as other police agencies are internationally. But it's also looking at our cases in terms of whether or not everything was done for victims that should have been done. So that victim-centric approach, both of which can be considered misconduct. Really, it's whether you're actually doing something you shouldn't have done, or you're failing to do those important things that you should have done. And so it's really about quality assurance in terms of ensuring we're doing everything we can for victims. And those internal processes to look at how these cases are being managed is really important, and it does feed into the work that we were talking about with respect to policy development. We can look at business process mapping and we can look at policy, but at the end of the day, even though those 2 pieces are really important, they're important because of the service delivery that a victim receives when they call, and that is the objective that we're constantly assessing, and so this is an opportunity to do that. Thank you.
Elaine?
Yes. Thank you for that presentation. Just to follow up on what Deputy Coxon was saying about service delivery, in relation to looking within the force and where officers may have barring orders against them or other such domestic violence or court orders against them, are those officers, is there a protocol to whether they're involved in subsequent call-outs to domestic violence incidents?
They are required to notify their chief super when that has occurred, and at that point in time the chief super determines what details they are able to do and not do, specifically so that the scenario you're describing does not occur. That is part of the review that we're doing to make sure that everybody who should have notified their chief super has done so, and also to make sure that they are doing work that's consistent with taking that into consideration. And that is also feeding into our internal vetting plans for the future. This is something I know we've talked about before, but certainly it's fed into the plan that we're developing around more robust internal vetting for this reason, to make sure that people who have are facing, whether it's a protection order or who have a conviction, certainly are not being placed in that situation.
And are there any disciplinary consequences for the non-disclosure of such orders by Gardaí?
Correct, that's misconduct, yes.
And I mean, so that there's an internal review of individuals who may or may not have disclosed such orders. That's an ongoing process.
Correct. Exactly.
And on service delivery, there was a report earlier this year in the Irish Times, an analysis of court service data, and by Eamon Cúnagan, a barrister, and found that over the last year, as you've correctly said, there's been an increase in the number of domestic violence charges. However, in the last couple of years, more than 2/3 of orders in domestic violence cases in district courts outside of Dublin have been struck out, withdrawn, or those charges dismissed. Now, there are many reasons why domestic violence charges are withdrawn, dismissed, or struck out. But is there a case where Gardaí themselves, may not have their proofs in order, may not be familiar with the court processes that are involved? And I know that there is training ongoing for guards, but is that something, given the high proportion of strikeouts in domestic violence incidents, that the guards are looking at in terms of their own delivery of those charges in a court setting?
I'll turn that over to Colin Noonan, but certainly it is being looked at, yes.
Yeah, and specifically on the prosecutions in court, and to tackle that exact issue that you've identified. In Dublin since March 2020, the Chief Prosecution Solicitor's Office represent An Garda Síochána for the prosecution of domestic abuse cases. And that is exactly to ensure that the proofs are there and the prosecution can succeed. And the plan is certainly to roll that out across the country. It's currently operational in Dublin. We have inspectors prosecuting domestic abuse cases in courts outside of Dublin. But it's certainly an issue that we're acutely aware of. It forms one of the core parts of the domestic abuse training. It forms part of the core message that we're delivering in all of our training and our briefings in respect of domestic abuse.
My last question, we had a committee meeting on Monday where we spoke to the inspector over training in Templemore, and we focused on the training of guards in court procedure, and there was an acknowledgement with COVID that a lot of training has been online, and perhaps sometimes when a new guard in the last few years who's been trained during COVID, the first time that they'll encounter a court setting is in a contentious case, and that perhaps the standard of training, because of the online nature, hasn't been as robust as otherwise. I mean, is there a review to perhaps look at those guards who have recently been trained to assist them in their ability in court procedure now that COVID has relented a small bit?
Well, even though through COVID, our foundation training did change in its nature, a lot of that practical training was still delivered. So and that would have included the skills required for court presentation, and that's my understanding, but I'll check on that. But we certainly were anxious that those practical skills would still be imparted. If there's something which has slipped through, then I'll have to inquire further about that. But in respect of the specific prosecutor point, we now have a position, as we've outlined in Dublin, in terms of the prosecution of protection orders and domestic abuse type cases, where it's not Gardaí who are presenting those. And then in the more rural areas, we do have experienced members, inspectors, who are prosecuting these cases, and we are specifically looking at further training that we might deliver for them in terms of their skills. There already is training for prosecution or for the skill of prosecuting for members, but we want to further enlarge on that. Obviously, laws get more complex, and we are picking up particular issues that need address. But that's specific about the foundation course and how much training they were getting face to face in respect to those practical skills. I hadn't heard that before, and just like to chase up on that.
Perhaps my colleague Stephen can.
Well, just very
Paul,
briefly.
sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, the meeting that Elaine was referring to on Monday, this issue specifically came up, and we were told that aspect of the training was not being delivered. And so from our perspective, I suppose it reinforces the concern that Elaine has raised, whether there's a link between the strikeout rates and cases not proceeding, etc., with that absence of training. So I think what you may have been referring to, Commissioner, in relation to the training of guards involved in the actual presentation of cases, that's a different thing. We were talking about court skills for new recruits. And I think the concern around that is that there then become evidential issues which result in problems for the prosecution further down the line.
Well, I'll pursue that further, because more face-to-face training is coming online. There are various phases that individuals will have to go through in their probation in terms of their phase training. So if there's a skill deficit there, we'll pick up on that. Thank you.
Quick question, Chair. Thank you very much for that and really interesting presentation, and it's really heartening to see such progress. I just want to ask you quickly, we've discussed in private meeting the service you can provide in relation to stalking. We know that new legislation is on the way, but I think it was very useful for us to hear what can be done under existing legislation. And I wonder, would you like this opportunity just to give a message out in public to victims of stalking in terms of what they might do?
Thank you very much, and I turn to Chief Superintendent Noonan there to set out the various pieces of legislation. There is legislation which we can use and should be used in these cases, and we would be active, and it would be our policy to be active and to make sure that we're protecting individuals from so-called stalking. So thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Commissioner. So specifically, and I suppose the first element of what was mentioned in the private meeting, the stalking.ie. So I've engaged personally with the founders of that group, and I suppose asked them how their knowledge, their experience could form part of future training opportunities, future briefing opportunities for Garda Síochána. So that's something we're actively pursuing in the Bureau. As you know, the law isn't quite, it's not enacted yet, the specific offence of stalking, but there is an offence under Section 10 of the Non-Fatal Offence Against a Person Act in respect of harassment. And that allows for investigations, it allows for Garda Síochána to investigate where people have been subject to harassment, are being watched, are being their movements are being monitored, and we can and we will and we do prosecute in respect of that offence.
And are you confident that there's a consistent understanding of that across the country?
I think it's part of our message, it's part of our training, and even in the last week, the specific focus or the specific availability of what harassment constitutes and how that should be prosecuted, how it should be examined, has been a part of our messaging out to operational members. Okay. So I think it is, to be fair, something that we're acutely aware of again, and something that we're focusing on. But it is there, and I think we are using it all the time.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner, I wonder if I could just follow up specifically on that very last point. In the extensive outreach work that the authority has done with a wide range of organisations, who are very active in this area. As you know, the majority of them say that the majority of the time the quality of this service is extremely good, and people have been very, very positive, as we have said in virtually every one of the 16 COVID reports that we sent to the Minister about the response of the Garda Síochána, about the effectiveness of Operation Fuishiv. But there is a steady sense of uncertainty about the extent to which that point that Valerie made, the consistency across the entire organisation, the extent to which individual Gardaí, who will be the first point of contact, have a comprehensive understanding of what it is that the law provides and permits. And the risk perhaps of a gap, if I can use that term, between the extent with the DPSU, the Protective Services Units, have expertise, but those with whom women will have the first contact may not have that same level of certainty and may not have the same level of sensitivity to the individual who comes forward and to how difficult it can be for somebody to come forward. It's, as I said at the beginning, it's not by any means the substantive percentage, but there is that residual concern, and I wonder what kind of assurance you can offer to people, or how satisfied you might be that the 92% of members who have had that training to which Chief Superintendent Noonan referred is actually striking home and bridging any gap that might exist.
Thank you, Chair. I think with the training's position is in position, 92% delivered, and that's very credible in terms of that achievement in itself. But as Síochána said earlier, we have the full gambit of our society within the organisation as well. So the next piece of that then is frankly the supervision and the quality of the supervision. Both immediately incidents are being actioned and dealt with, and that's in part with the control rooms, but also then the active sergeants and inspectors, but also then the divisional processes which follow up on these calls. And I might ask just Anne-Marie just to set out what the structure is there, but there is a specific focus on these, and we do place our faith not just in the training that we've provided and the quality of people we have, but also then in the methodical way that these incidents are supervised and checked up upon. And that's, I think, in part that's evidenced by our callback ratio, and where we've put focus on something, then we've seen an uptick in delivery of performance in terms of callbacks. So Anne-Marie, please.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. So I suppose there's a couple of prongs to our approach in this. One is through our Victim Services Office, of which there's one in every division, and they do the callbacks to victims of crime. Secondly, then, we have our performance and accountability framework meetings, which go on right throughout the organisation at station level, at district level, and at divisional level, but particularly the district levels, which are the hands-on business units of the day. And all those incidents are reviewed on a daily basis. So, and appropriate follow-up is either triggered or commented on, or a comment for the supervisor. In addition to that, then they're put back for review. So they're reviewed, perhaps a number of weeks hence, or whatever appropriate to the particular circumstance. So there is quite an intrusive approach in terms of our management of these incidents, and as the Commissioner has said, the callbacks is a big part of that as well. So there's kind of three different layers to it in terms of how we manage it and ensure that consistency. And side by side with that, just more generally, so we have the domestic violence risk assessment tool, which is coming on stream now as well. So it's in place in the northwestern region, went live in the southern region on the 15th of February, and we're moving now into the eastern region. So I suppose the reason I'm saying or mentioning that is that there is a very consistent conversation going on throughout the organisation in terms of the victim, the focus on victims, and how victims can come to harm. And obviously, the specific question is around the stalking, the harassment, and we're acutely aware of that, and in terms of what Section 10 allows us to do. So there's constant messaging. I'm not saying that there is enough, but it's constant. And I would be confident that as we work our way through this, that the whole of the organisation will have a greater appreciation of the importance and the nuances of a lot of these cases, and that what one might hear initially mightn't be the complete picture. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Deputy Commissioner, and thank you, Commissioner, as well. I think that's been a useful conversation. One of the essential messages, of course, is that people who are in difficulty, who have encountered difficulty, should make contact with the Garda Síochána, should, if appropriate, telephone 999 or go to their local Garda station, because all of those services and facilities will be there for them. One of the problems is that people may be, for whatever reason, deterred from doing that or feel lacking confidence in doing that. But that's a critical message, and we'll come to that in a different context later on in the meeting. So thank you for that. I should have said at the very beginning a welcome to Chief Superintendent Colm Noonan and Sergeant Aidan Brady, both of whom are attending their first public meetings of the authority. You're very welcome. The next item on our agenda relates to information and technology. We have, at very many meetings in private and in public since the authority was established, engaged with this question of information and technology, as well as with issues of human resources, workforce planning, financial management. Not because they're technical issues or not because they're boring administrative back office issues, but because they're central to the nature and quality of the policing service that is made available. The authority has, in discharge of one of its responsibilities under the law, made regular reports to the Minister on its judgment of the requirements of the organisation, the adequacy of its resources in relation to the discharge of its functions. And very specifically, we have raised this question of the adequacy of the capital provision in terms of upgrading, modernising, renewing the extent of the technological infrastructure, if I can use that cumbersome term, within Garda Síochána. And we thought it would be useful, as part of today's public meeting, to hear and to engage with you and your colleagues on the close and clear and essential linkage between this technology, what is possible with it, and how it links into, again, keeping people safe and providing a most effective policing service. Just by way of background introduction. And I think Andrew is probably going to, or perhaps you may want to say something.
Andrew's a presentation, and that will set out our vision and what we're doing. But you're correct, this and the provision of ICT cuts across many aspects of policing. It's important, one, just because of just the amount of crime which is now facilitated through cyber. So we need to have the ability, obviously, to investigate such crimes as online frauds, be it investment fraud, romance fraud, be it all the various scams which are launched at people through the internet and email and over phones and by phone calls, etc. So that's an essential part of our policing role is now in the cyberspace, and also then protecting organisations from such events as ransomware. And obviously we had a huge attack on the HSE last year of ransomware, and we've been very active then in the investigation of that since, and all of that requires ICT investment. There's also then a piece just about the policing information that we need and our access to it. That's facilitated through our own Pulse system, but we've seen definite benefits in terms of our connection to the Schengen system, the amount of information then that we've retrieved then from our colleagues in Europe, and the amount of assistance that we've received both in identifying perpetrators here and our European colleagues identifying perpetrators and bringing them to justice. Again, another real benefit in terms of keeping people here in Ireland safe, and also keeping our European neighbours safe as well. And then lastly, I think that just for myself and the rest of the senior team, the management information that we want to have, we have a very considerable budget, over $2 billion this year. It's a large organisation, 19,000 full-time employees is what we're aiming towards. And so that's a very considerable organisation. We want to have the human resources information, but we also want to have the costing information behind that. And that management information then helps us in terms of our effectiveness, also our efficiency, and how well we use the money that we're given, the public money that we're given, to deliver on a policing service. So all these areas are vital. Some areas we're doing really well, and I think we are at the head of the class in terms of the innovation that we've brought and the productivity and the efficiency we've achieved. But other areas we frankly are lagging behind, and we have a lot more to do. And also then we know that more is coming our way, the digital recording bill and the advent of powers specifically around automatic number plate recognition, CCTV, but also the use of body-worn camera by Garda members. These are all really important innovations which will support policing and support our mission, but ultimately will allow us to detect and prevent crime as well. So if I turn to Andrew has a presentation, and if we go through the presentation, then perhaps the questions then after that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner, and thanks, Chair. So my colleague Sergeant Brady and I will give you just a quick overview of the way that Garda Síochána is combining data and technology, and it's really the combination of the two that's important. It's not just data or technology, it's the combination of the two, and how we're using that to improve policing effectiveness and performance. So I'll give an overview of the vision that the Commissioner mentioned there. I'll introduce the types of people and the types of roles that are delivering some of these major projects, and then Sergeant Brady, as an operational supervisor, will describe how the use of one of those systems, the roster and duty management system, impacts on his work and that of supervisors and Gardaí generally. So our goal with information, our goal really is information-led policing, and that's the 8th principle of the Commission for the Future of Policing in Ireland. So as we all know, and as we touched on already, society is increasingly digitising, and therefore crime tends to follow patterns in society. Crime is also digitising. And while cybercrime and online fraud are the more obvious forms, it's now definitely the case that every major investigation includes a significant component of digital evidence, be that social media, be it footage that's uploaded to evidence that's stored on devices and then needs to be retained. So we're in the process of responding to that by digitising policing, and just it's important to understand, I suppose, that digital in the context of policing means the combination of the electronic devices, of the data, but also then with Gardaí on the ground. This is about providing information and digital tools to Gardaí, and again, it's that combination, it's that connection between the two that's really critical. The second point that I just want to make is around innovation and our approach to innovation. It's not just the introduction of new technologies. The really important thing is that we make it operational. And we've invested very heavily in a concept called user experience, where we put the guard basically, or we put the user at the centre of absolutely everything that we build. Everything is intended to give them the information and the data that can help them do their job better and more efficiently. So, for example, with the smartphones that are being rolled out, there is no training associated with those. A guard gets a box with their new smartphone. They take it out of the box. It's already charged. They log in using their existing credentials, and they go and do their work using the apps. There's no training that's required. The system is completely intuitive, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. The final point to note, I suppose, in an organisation like ours is the notion of scale. There's a term in engineering that says that scale changes everything. So if you're building a bridge for one person to cross a stream, a few planks of wood will do. That changes completely if you have to build a bridge that's going to accommodate heavy traffic. And that's exactly the same for ours, for everything that we build. It has to work 24/7. It has to accommodate 15 to 20,000 users. It has to be fast, and it has to be completely reliable from the side of the road to up the side of a mountain, wherever guards need to do their work. So, for example, there in the case of traffic stops with the smartphones, the really key thing about this is that the guards, when they're observing a vehicle approaching them, instead of in the old days just having to physically observe it with no real information, they now know everything about that vehicle, and in some cases its driver, that the entire organisation knows. So we put the entire power of the organisation, everything we know, in the hand of that Garda. So just to explain a little bit more about that, previously, in order to get at that information, which wouldn't really be practical, obviously, the Garda on the ground at a checkpoint would have to have access to 8 different systems in order to get at that same information. And now instead, all of those 8 systems are combined in an application which is highly intuitive, highly designed around them to help them do their jobs. And if there's nothing of concern, they can just wave the vehicle on instead of having to slow down and engage with everybody. They can really focus on the people and the cars that shouldn't be on the road or have issues with them. So our vision, as I've said, is all about how we acquire and how we access data from multiple sources. And that could be from other agencies, it could be from the likes of insurance companies, it could be driving licence files. Increasingly, it's data that's shared with us from other police organisations. We have to then acquire that data. We have to associate an identity with it so that we can link it to our existing data, and then use the skills and technologies that we have to turn that into information. Raw data isn't much use to anybody. Really, what we're trying to produce is actionable insight and to produce knowledge, again, for increased policing effectiveness and efficiency. So that's the vision that we've developed. It's very much in keeping with sort of industry standards, which recognises the increasing role of data, not just technology. Again, it's the combination of this data and technology, and everything is about moving data through that system as we acquire it from our own sources and externally to continually add value to it, both from the perspective of policing, but also, as the Commissioner said, producing management information on the way that our resources are being deployed. So, just in summary, then, of the vision is that it's very much about providing data through smartphones and applications that are focused on police, but as well as that, we really want to eliminate paper as much as possible from our processes. We overall want to increase the value of data to the organisation, and the really key thing is that we connect all of our systems. I'll explain a little bit more about the number of systems that we've got in a minute. And the really important thing is that we do this at pace. As the Commissioner said, there are some areas where we're absolutely at the leading edge, such as the new CAD2 system, such as our mobile system and the investigation management system. But there are other systems that are quite old at this stage, or that we just don't have at all, and we really want to accelerate the development of those. So when I turn then to the people that are delivering this, and this is perhaps not necessarily all of these folks would fit the mould or the narrative, I suppose, that's out there around civilians in a kind of a policing service. It looks perhaps more like a kind of a tech multinational, but all of these roles are absolutely critical. They may not individually, one for one, free up an individual Garda, so-called, from a desk job or an administrative job, but they absolutely improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the organisation overall. And that ranges from crime and data analysts, who are effectively detectives in their own right. They're directly embedded with investigation teams to analyse this digital evidence with the investigation teams, and then the next day they could be working with a chief superintendent or an assistant commissioner to provide them with advice and predictive analytics on how best to deploy their resources. So just a quick plug on that. For the first time in 3 years, we're launching a major campaign that's open at the moment for the recruitment of crime and data analysts. So then we also have roles such as the data architect that's responsible for ingesting this massive amount of data from other systems, and again, critically, the role of the user experience engineer in designing systems that are completely intuitive, requires little training as possible to make guards and administrative staff as effective as possible in their jobs. So just a little bit of kind of history then on our systems. So in the beginning there was Pulse back in 1999, and at the time it was very much leading edge technology. And despite again some of the commentary around Pulse, we're not going to replace Pulse. Pulse is an amazingly powerful tool. It's a very rich repository of information with 20 years of data at this stage. But what we are doing is surrounding it with increasingly with other systems that are much more intuitive and easier to use. Again, such as the smartphone apps. So we have not just Pulse, we have 240 odd systems in total between our administrative systems and our policing systems. And again, what we're doing is in the process of modernizing, but more to the point, connecting those systems in the interest of bringing information both about policing investigations and also the way that resources are deployed inside the organization to improve the effectiveness of police investigations, of policing generally, and then also to improve efficiencies through better use of information. So just what that picture there shows is that, again, in common with any large organization, our systems, as soon as they're deployed, so at the very top end, we have things like the mobile platform. We have CAD2, which is just coming into deployment. But these systems tend to atrophy then very quickly, so it requires constant effort to continue to maintain them. Okay, I'm going to move on to just talk about some of these systems in a little bit more detail. You might have seen there in the architecture picture, it was the data hub, which is really now our repository for bringing all of this data together, and that's based on a leading edge data technology. We have the investigation management system, where previously it was necessary to pull together, again, multiple systems in order to progress investigations. Now that's all done by a single system that is an overarching system for reviewing or for managing investigations. We have frontline mobility, as I mentioned earlier on there, with nearly 5,000 devices deployed at this stage, and pretty much eliminated paper from the process of issuing traffic fines in particular, but will be used for elsewhere. One other development on the mobile devices, in fact all devices, is video conferencing, which is accelerated during the pandemic, but now is very much here to stay. So, for example, there with Middleton Garda Station, instead of sergeants and inspectors having to travel from the stations around what's a very large district in East Cork, instead of that, for their PAF meetings, they can attend remotely. And it's also being used to conduct on-sign assessments by supervisors, as the example there between the sergeant and one of our guards. Likewise, the Schengen Information System, as the Commissioner mentioned there, is directly effective in terms of making Ireland much less attractive to people that have criminal records, in fact are wanted abroad, making it much easier for them to identify, much easier for guards to identify them. We're in the process of building out that into an application, so that will be integrated into the smartphone. CAD2 is a complete replacement of our existing dispatch technology, so replacing the 3 or 4 systems, physical systems and computers, as you can see there, that sit on a dispatcher's desk, and making that again into a much more user experience-based dispatch process. Our enterprise content management system, again deployed, is a mechanism for digitizing the massive amounts of paper that we have as an organization. And then next to last is our PAF application, which makes sure that in those PAF and performance and accountability framework meetings, that they're run in a consistent way, that actions are tracked, and that the information on the crime incidents that happened in the district overnight are directly available to the superintendent or to the inspector. And that consistency is really key, obviously, as we move from across all of the districts and across all of the tens or even hundreds of PAF meetings that take place every day. And then finally, then just on the RDMS system that's currently being rolled out, that's the roster and duty management system, which allows guards to see their own shift pattern, to clock on and clock off, but then more importantly allows their supervisors to to plan out their resources and their budget. And one important change that we've made there recently, again listening to the members and their use of this system, instead of having to physically go to a Garda station to clock on, that RDMS system is now available to them on their mobile phone. So if they need to go to court, if they need to go to checkpoint or to some other operation, then they can do that directly on their phone, saving them the time of going to the station. So with that, I'd like to introduce and hand over to Sergeant Brady from Dunleary Garda Station and his experience of using RDMS.
Thank you. We've had RDMS in the Dimore East since 2018, so coming up on about 4 years now. We were the pilot location for it. It's an off-the-shelf piece of software tailored to the specifications of Garda Síochána. There's two major elements to it. The first being the time and attendance element that Andrew alluded to, and that's where Garda members book in or book off a clocking in system. And that then drives the automation of the payment of allowances and overtime, absence management, and also then ensures the management of the European Working Time Directive. The second element to RDMS is the planning element, and that's probably the most important element to it. So RDMS requires duty planning offices to be created at a divisional level who will administer the system, but also then those duty planners have responsibility for a particular geographical area and for making sure that the demands for that area are met. So they're using the software, but also other data streams. And as we've come a little bit down the line and as some of these processes have bedded in, it's allowed those duty planners to not just look at RDMS in terms of getting the data, but they're also looking at Pulse. They're also looking at CAD in terms of how many calls for service there are in a particular area. They're distilling then that information into something more palatable and on a daily basis are giving that management information to the team, the management team of the division, to help them with their PAF meetings. And there's feedback then to the duty planners as a result of that information to try and ensure, I suppose, that the right person is in the right place with the right skills at the right time.
Thank you both very much for that. Donald?
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation. One of the things that strikes me is there's been significant underinvestment in technology, not just in the Garda Síochána, but in other areas of the public service in IT. So you have a big programme of work, which at the current rate of investment would probably take maybe a decade to realise. In those circumstances, you're very resource constrained. So how do you determine priorities, or what criteria do you use to actually determine which projects you're going to put at the top of the list?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Donald. Yeah. So as you picked up on there, while we are very productive, we're probably one of the biggest estates, I suppose, in the public service at any one time. We've got 50 active projects, but at the moment we've got another 90 projects that haven't started that could have very significant operational impact, but we just haven't been able to get to. So we have a very comprehensive planning process, which means that as the requirement for these systems is identified, that they're documented, they're scoped out in terms of the amount of effort that they might require, and also then we look at the sequencing, because often there's a logical sequencing associated with how we might deliver these systems. We have an ICT prioritisation board then that's chaired by an assistant commissioner and is primarily made up of operational policing senior management that helps determine then, I suppose, the priority that we're going to attach to delivery systems. But so first and foremost, I suppose we focus on operational policing if it can be helped. improve the effectiveness of policing and investigations, put more data in the hands of members. They tend to get the highest priority. And unfortunately, what that means then is we probably invest less in things like our administrative systems. We've known for some time that we need to develop a much more comprehensive HR information system and finance systems as well. So we're really focused, I suppose, on the systems that are most likely to improve policing effectiveness. But again, it's determined by that prioritisation board.
My understanding is you have about 15 million for sort of what I would call investment, real investment, new stuff at the moment. If that degree of investment could be accelerated, could you help us understand what the benefits of that acceleration might be, and in particular how they might impact on the public so that they might see the benefits of this?
Sure. Yeah, so as you say, just to be clear on the numbers, we have a very substantial ICT budget. It's actually about 120 million in total. But as I mentioned there, we have a very large number of systems that need to be maintained. It's not just a case of keeping the lights on. These are active systems that require to be constantly upgraded just to be kept current, and that's where the bulk of the investment goes. And that means, exactly as you say, that we have about 15 million that we can invest annually in building brand new systems or in adopting new technologies. So really, it's a case of pace. I mean, we have a very clear vision for where we want to try to go to. For those 90 projects that I mentioned, we've in most cases scoped out what needs to get done. So I mean, just to give one example, I suppose, of where we could and where we want to accelerate is this notion of digital evidence management. So you see a lot of talk around people wanting to contribute to investigations by uploading their CCTV or their dashcam footage. And that sheer volume of information, we've gone perhaps from 10 years ago to having a couple of hundred hours of CCTV footage. It wouldn't be unusual now in a very high profile case that there'll be 10,000 hours of footage. So the ability of guards to be able to process that information, guards and analysts, means sitting in front of screens, a bit like a television cop show from the 1990s, kind of pressing fast forward and so on. So the ability to be able to handle that vast amount of digital evidence would lead to much faster, I suppose, processing of those events. But just to pick one other example, which is economic crime. And economic crime, again, is an area that has accelerated dramatically, obviously, during the pandemic. And it hasn't been an area that we've been able to keep pace on, both in terms of the analyst support and the technology. And it's a case in many economic crimes where there will never be a prosecution in Ireland because the perpetrator is outside of this jurisdiction. But the outcome is very much, for the victim, is very much time dependent. So if we can accelerate the investigation time period so that we can intercept the funds that have been stolen within about 24 hours or so and get at that money, at least they will get their money back, or a substantial portion of their money back. So that's another area that we'd very much like to invest in, where we have this two examples there, I suppose, of time critical and volume critical investigations that technology is absolutely essential to. It's just not practical to look at 10, 20,000 hours, obviously, of video footage without the right digital evidence management tools, and again, without technology and without giving analysts and data scientists support to economic crime. They'll find it much harder to retrieve those funds in time. So that's just two examples, I suppose, but there are another 90 maybe or so where they came from.
Thanks for that. Not for today, but I think it would be helpful to help if we could understand more the benefits that might flow from accelerated investment in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. We have very strong cost-benefit analysis on certainly on all of our systems.
Yeah. We can explore that some other day. Thank you, Chairman.
Elaine, sorry.
Thank you. I found the presentation really interesting in the sense that it very deliberately shows how the nature of policing has changed, and sometimes the focus can just be on boots on streets, but the nature of crime itself has changed to cybercrime, and what your presentation outlined is the Garda response through the use of technology to combat that new nature of crime. So I was wondering if you could just speak to me about one particular type of cybercrime and how you hope to respond in a resource way to dealing with that. So the Garda National Cyber Crime Bureau has reported a 3-year backlog in the examination of devices seized in the investigation of child sex abuse. So with that delay in the examination of those devices, there's obvious consequences therein for the victims that are involved and potentially people coming forward as well. So what would your response to that be?
Well, I suppose there's two aspects to it. I mean, one is the resourcing of the cybercrime investigators, and that's being addressed through the rollout now of regional cybercrime hubs. So instead of everything having to come into the centre, which is obviously part of perhaps creating a kind of a bottleneck, is the rollout then of these cybercrime hubs. But the other piece definitely is on the technology side through direct access to technology in terms of the workstations that the analysts are equipped with, but then also increasingly our ability to connect in with other agencies. These crimes, obviously by their nature, are international. They often happen somewhere else, or they start somewhere else. They may touch Ireland, certainly touch on victims in Ireland, but they tend to be international in nature. So it's this ability again to be able to track the data, because the data tracks the crime. The data in many cases is the crime, and to be able to track that and to analyse it at speed. So I mean, there's two elements to it really. One is the rate at which we can get the approvals, and then we can hire the analysts themselves, and then also the investment in the technology to give them the tools that they need to do to keep up with, I suppose, developments in other agencies, but then also to be able to work with those agencies using the same types of tools that they work with. And as you'd appreciate, these are very expensive pieces of equipment. So that's really the two components to it.
Commissioner, do you want to come in?
Well, it's just to add that now nearly most crime is now involving the examination of a smartphone. So, a serious road traffic collision will involve the examination of a smartphone to see whether it was being used at the time of the collision or what its use was on the journey before that. So, as the technology evolves, then the more and more it's been used in various incidents as well. So there is huge demand, and I think we're no different from other police services in terms of these backlogs. As Andrea said, there is investment required, and the other thing which we really welcome in the digital recording bill is just a clarity around the examination of these, and then the evidential standards as well. And that clarity is really important in terms of dealing with these matters, reporting them to the Director of Public Prosecutions, and then ultimately towards conclusion in criminal justice setting. And we want to obviously stick with the European standards around that, and I think that's very important, particularly around child abuse images, where a lot of these images are shared, are classified by other law enforcement organisations, and we can dip in effect to their expertise and the work that they've done before us in terms of the classification without the actual single manual classification of literally tens of thousands of images. So that's a real efficiency that we can find from one, being a European standard, and two, that connectivity, and then thirdly then the law which will back that up in terms of the digital recording bill. And Andrew's already touched upon being able to receive and then catalogue and keep evidence, electronic evidence, safely, and that's a very important development for us as well. Just the amount of information we're already receiving from CCTV, mobile phone footage, etc., is huge, and that'll grow as we start to use digital recording ourselves in terms of the body-worn camera and other CCTV systems.
Because this issue touches upon the previous topic we discussed in terms of domestic violence, and perhaps there may be a reluctance by some victims of domestic violence to hand up their devices in cases where they mightn't get those devices returned for a period of time, and that may delay or have an impact on the ability of the guards then to prosecute those cases. So, I mean, from your point of view, then increased investment in this area would increase efficiencies in crimes that are very sensitive in terms of child sex abuse images and domestic violence.
Well, earlier we outlined, the prevalence of crime where there's been a relationship, either ongoing or previously an intimate relationship. a lot of evidence can be gleaned then from the messages which have been sent backwards and forwards, and victims then find that in effect we are keeping their mobile phone in that it contains actual evidence which supports the prosecution. So that can be a difficulty, and I know it's a difficulty that we're very aware of, and what we might then do to ease that particular problem in terms of substitute phone. I think that's probably the only way through that, but one thinks then, you know, of people investing heavily in a mobile phone, maybe a mobile phone rental contract, and then in effect not being able to have the benefit of that for a couple of years. So that is a significant issue and growing issue, and we need to find an answer to that. But also, I would point out there's very valuable evidence there, and we can't overlook it. We have to address that problem.
And so you need increased investment, really, from a technological point of view, for those phones for domestic violence victims.
Well, it's almost a one-for-one replacement issue as much as the technology. Certainly we want the technology to be able to download the messages, download the images from them and the messages, and have those in an evidential context. But still we will hold on to the phone so we've best evidence, and that's simply, you know, a one-for-one replacement issue then. But we're very aware of that, and I know the department also is very aware of this particular issue as well.
Paul.
Can I just ask one follow-up, Andrew? I'm not sure if it was you that mentioned, I think, economic crime. I'm not sure if this falls within your area, but one of the recommendations of the Hamilton Review Group was that the Guards should develop a long-term strategic plan to ensure adequate resourcing for the Economic Crime Bureau, and that should have been submitted to the Policing Authority in the middle of last year. Now, that report hasn't been submitted, and I'm just wondering, I'm not sure whose bailiwick that falls under, but is there a reason for that, especially when it would seem self-evident that at a time of increasing need for resources, that's something that you would want to do?
There's a bid that we've been dealing through our workforce planning for increased resources around Economic Crime Bureau, but if I turn to John just to set out the specifics around the working group there is in this.
Yeah, just to add to that, the Department of Justice has set up a working group arising from the Hamilton report, and the Chief Superintendent, who is head of bureau in the Economic Crime Bureau, Pat Lorden, sits on that, and that group is examining the recommendations and the implementation of those recommendations. And we've had a recruitment campaign in the not-so-distant past for the Economic Crime Bureau. So there are additional resources readily available now as we come out of COVID to add to those resources that have already been put into the Economic Crime Bureau in the past year or so. So, you know, there will be greater progress now that we are back in the business of training to a greater extent than we were able to engage in during the COVID pandemic, and that is a prioritisation in the economic crime area.
And I just wonder, I don't want to labour this issue, but I just wonder when might we see the plan in relation to the resources? I think the Chief Executive wrote to the Guards in the middle of last year, after the expiration of the date at which we were supposed to get it.
Yeah, well, we would submit a business case, as we describe it, to the HR department, and that will of course be influenced by the outcome of the deliberations of the working group arising from the Hamilton report, and that will feed into it. I don't have a specific timeline that I can offer at this stage, but we'll consult with HR and see what the best prediction can be in relation to that.
Well, there is a business case. I've seen the business case when we reviewed it. So, if it's in terms of just answering on a business case, that can be done quite quickly. We're not. The request may have slipped my mind, but I know the work has been going on. So we'll follow that through in terms of response.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you.
And just a final point. Thank you. Unmute myself. A final point arising from Elaine's question, Commissioner. There was a programme on Channel 4 Television UK on Tuesday night, I think, on this very question of the potential deterrent effect of people having to surrender their their personal mobile phones. And a reference made to a UK policy position that phones should be returned within 24 hours. Not observed much in practice, it should be said. But it was an interesting point that that was a public policy position, if true, if accurate. Is there any potential for something of that nature, whereby the contents of the phone could be downloaded in a way that was secure and evidentially proofed, so that the device could be returned to somebody and that they could resume normal life, as it were?
So I've seen this work in practice. The problem is that technologically it's possible, provided we had people in place, in terms of doing the downloads and the technology available, both of which are a challenge. Having said that, though, as the Commissioner spoke to, and this is the danger of it and where it may not translate well here, and that is the best evidence is not just what's downloaded from the phone, it's the phone itself. And so if that evidence is challenged in court and, defense brings an argument that maybe there was tampering or there was an issue with the download, if that phone, the original phone, has gone back, you then lose the case. So that best evidence piece, I would say there's significant risk in looking at a policy like that. I think that the idea of actually just giving another phone, if possible, would be more effective, because the risk to the victims in those cases is that the case may be lost as a result.
Is this an area where some interdisciplinary engagement between the Garda Síochána, the court service, the judiciary, the Department of Justice might find some resolution of that?
My experience in this is no, because it's none of those parties that create the challenge. The challenge is when defense comes forward and challenges the evidence, right? Yeah. So that's the issue.
And I understand that point, but statutes can be remarkably effective in resolving problems sometimes.
Well, I know the department are aware of this. If we are to increase the number of successful prosecutions, these are obvious things we have to resolve. This has become, I hadn't been even aware of this until about the last 12 months, but it's become more of a feature around the willingness of complainants to stick with a criminal justice case, in the fact that they feel that they're being impacted on very negatively, because there's still this ongoing maybe investment in a 50 or 60 euro monthly contract and no phone. And so whilst the phone languishes in a Garda station somewhere in an evidence bag, so it is something we have to address. It would be nice to think we could do a complete download and that would be sufficient, but just at the same time, defence has found examination of a phone to be actually a proper tactic to use in these trials as well. So there's a difficult point here in terms, I think, of the download approach, and I'm not sure how successful it is in England and Wales. We could examine that, but I do think we may have to adopt an alternative approach, which may be just one of simple replacement for a period of time.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, colleagues on that. I'm very conscious of the clock, which could once again win the race. The next item we had on the agenda is the CAD 999 question. And those who are looking at this or listening to this meeting will know that for very many months now this has been a significant matter of engagement, both for the Garda Síochána itself over the last 15, 16 months, but also for the authority since throughout 2021 and this year. It was a significant thing that at the November last year public meeting, the Commissioner accepted the findings of Derek Penman's interim report and subsequently identified that the Garda Síochána accepted most of the recommendations. There's important work to be done. We identified at the last public meeting and subsequently that there was an issue in relation to, a legal issue in relation to securing access to listening to some of the calls. we are reasonably confident that those issues can be resolved. We're awaiting the finalisation of a legal opinion. There have been close conversations between the authority and the Garda Síochána, and we would hope that it will probably not be before the end of March, simply because of availability of people, but that very shortly thereafter that phase of the Derek Penman inquiry can be continued so that we can get a more complete assurance both for the Commissioner, for the authority, and more particularly for the public. Because relative to something I said earlier, one of the underlying points that we have been making throughout these conversations about the cancellation of CAD 999 incidents is that it does not, in the slightest sense, or should not act as a deterrent to people from calling 999 in whatever emergency they find themselves in. And if I could ask Shalom.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank Garda Síochána for furnishing us with their management response to Mr. Penman's report. And I'm going to go through that response, perhaps with yourself, Deputy Commissioner. So the first recommendation was that the Gardaí should undertake an urgent review to ensure effective supervision, quality assurance and robust performance management processes in all control rooms and for all call takers and dispatchers. And I understand that that recommendation is accepted, and the response from the Gardaí is that it's been actioned presently. So I wonder if you could tell us what stage that action is at, and if you could tell us what effective supervision will look like or does look like, and what robust performance management measures have been put in place and what that looks like.
Okay, thank you, Shalom. So in terms of the resourcing for CAD, there is a business plan prepared by the action sponsor, Assistant Commissioner O'Brien, in terms of the resources for the control rooms, and that's at every level, both at the Garda and Garda staff level, and also crucially at the supervisory level. So that's currently being considered by workforce planning, and will be making its way to the executive for consideration. And in the context then, but I suppose what I can say at this stage is that it is an enhanced level of supervisory presence across each of the 4 control rooms. In terms of the supervision, the quality assurance and the robust performance management. So in terms of the quality assurance, our inspection and review process now applies to the control room. So that involves a dip sampling of a number of calls and them being critiqued from a quality and service perspective. So that's up and running in each of the 4 control rooms. And I suppose the robust performance management process, while they're in place in line with the level of supervision that's currently available, when we have the enhanced supervision, that will obviously increase as well. And when CAD 2 comes into being, we'll be in a better position to listen to calls and to have that active supervision on a daily basis. So that very much is a work in progress, and it is incrementally being progressed.
And from your dip sampling of calls and the critique of those calls, have you identified any particular issues?
Yes, only in the last 10 days or so it has come to my attention. I'm waiting on a written report that there are two call takers, and again, I don't want to go into too much detail because there's a process in place, but they require further examination and in terms of their sufficiency of standard.
Okay, well, we will maybe come back to that, I'm sure we will, and we would look for more detail on that. But does that also show you that in terms of the effective supervision and the additional measures that have been put in place and the performance management measures that have been put in place since this issue first came to light, is that showing up remaining or existing faults despite all of the measures that have been introduced since the issues with call taking and dispatching came to light?
Well, what it is saying really, I suppose, is that the systems and the processes that are currently in place from a supervisory and a quality assurance perspective are working. It's not good enough, and it's not good news to hear that there are still issues. But I suppose the important thing from our point of view is that we're looking for them, and if they're there, we'll find them.
Yes, and I accept that, but given how much attention this has received, it is very disappointing to hear that there are still issues. So, I mean, I suppose the devil will be in the detail, and when we get the detail of what exactly those problems were, we will have to come back to it. The second recommendation was that the Garda Síochána should review its approach to recording calls to local stations and also develop a call strategy nationally. And I note from your response that review has been undertaken by a review group within the CAD2 programme, and I wonder, is that getting enough attention if it's within a CAD2 implementation or review programme?
So, yes, it is part of the CAD2, I suppose, project. But I can tell you in the shorter term, and what has already happened is a triaging of calls at the local level. So, so in practical terms, what that means is that if somebody rings a local station, they're asked by whoever answers or takes the call what they're reporting. If it's a crime or an incident, they're automatically then transferred to the control room. And once they're transferred to the control room, while they're being transferred to the control room, the call taker in the public office in the Garda station stays on the line, and when the caller is accepted at the CAD room, they're told then that from that point on that their call is being recorded, and the original call receiver, if I can put it that way, bows out and the CAD system takes over. So that has been rolled out, I think, in 4 stations thus far, and the plan is to incrementally roll that out to further stations. So what that in effect does, it removes, I suppose, the risk of a call not being actioned. So that will be a key tenet of how we're going to work into the future as a means of mitigating risk and making sure that calls are captured and dealt with through the CAD system, and that appropriate incidents on pulse are created accordingly then.
Is that test of the 4 stations that you mentioned, is that your test, your pilot test that was referred to at our last meeting?
Yes.
And so, am I correct in saying then that there's still no plan to record calls to local stations, that the plan is to transfer them and then record them?
Yes.
Okay. So is there a danger then that if maybe somebody under an extreme pressure were to make a call to a local station and couldn't stay on the line for very long, that information could be lost or not recorded?
Well, I suppose that's where we will have training in relation to this. We'll have organisational policy in relation to it, and from our point of view, it's a fairly robust mitigation in the context of making sure that calls are dealt with and are recorded on the CAD system once they're identified as calls or incidents that require such a response.
And do you think that current rollout, that meets Mr Penman's recommendation?
Well, I think what it does is, I mean, I suppose part of our concern with this recommendation was the fact that we're very much a community-based organisation. There's a huge connection between the people of the community and the local Garda station. And I suppose it's a balance that we have to strike in the context of making sure that callers get an appropriate response, but equally making sure that they feel that they can contact their local Garda station as opposed to going to a centralised call answering system. So that's the balance that we have to strike.
Do you do any quality assurance or review of those calls to iron out any difficulties that might exist? For example, if there, if the caller is finding it difficult when the call is being transferred, to make sure it's not confusing and to make sure that they're reassured that if they stay on the line, they'll get the appropriate response. Are you reviewing those calls to make sure that those issues are dealt with?
So, just the first part of the question, in the context of the caller staying on the line and getting the response at the CAD room, the call responder at the original point of contact stays on the line until that call is picked up by the CAD. So that's one piece of, making sure. The second piece is then that those calls will I suppose, go into the larger pool of calls that will be subject to the performance management, the quality assurance, the inspection reviews, and so forth.
So is the first part of the call not part of a performance review at any stage? Or quality review?
Not at the moment, no. It's the CAD piece that's subject to that inspection and review.
Okay.
But as the policy isn't written in relation to, we're working our way through this. This is very much a very, I suppose, prompt response to something that Mr. Penman had some concern about.
If I could move on to your continued review of priority one calls and the calls that weren't, didn't form part of your initial review. So my understanding is that there was a recommendation that those calls would be reviewed to make sure that there were no incidents of harm or adverse impact. And could I ask you how you're progressing with that review? And then also I'm going to ask you what your progress is in relation to the review of priority 2 and 3 calls.
Okay. So in terms of our review of the priority 1 calls. So there was 2,932 calls that had to be examined, arising out of the cancelled incidents. So where we've got to in relation to that, there's 2,100 have been assessed from, from all the perspectives, including harm. And arising out of that, then there are approximately 20 calls that we have some further work to do in the context of harm. What I mean by that is that there is incomplete or ambiguous information in the pulse incident. So we have some further work to do with victims to, to satisfy ourselves whether or not harm was actually present in those calls. So that's where we are in relation to that. In terms of the other 2, the remaining priority 1 calls and the Intel or reviews. So some work has been done in relation to that. But it hasn't been completed, and the recommendation is that we would take, I suppose, what one might call a pragmatic approach to that, based on what we know already, the work done already, and I suppose the law of diminishing returns. So there will be a keyword search done into both of those categories, and that has not been completed yet.
Has it started?
No.
And do you have a planned start date?
Well, I'm going to turn to my colleague Andrew. I suppose we're trying to do a lot of things all at once. So
no, I understand that, but obviously, where you're telling us that you still have 20 calls to investigate where there's potential harm, and then you're doing a less thorough search in relation to priority 2 and 3 incidents, and that hasn't even started. That's of significant concern.
Okay, so in terms of the word search, that has not started. However, at the outset of this process, there was considerable work done in looking at those particular calls that you refer to from a risk and harm perspective. So it's not that nothing has been done, it's just it hasn't been completed.
Okay, but the word search...
The word search hasn't been done, no.
Okay.
Can I just ask Andrew to come in terms of...
Yeah, sure. So again, it's important to understand that that we picked out of the priority 1 calls, the 21,000 odd priority 1 calls, we picked the 6,000 that were most likely to result in harm to people. And as the deputy said, out of those there were 2,900 calls approximately that appeared to be cancelled incorrectly. So all of the effort has been, because they are the highest risk incidents, in drilling down on those to get to the absolute finality of was there any harm to the victims, and it's out of that those 20 cases remain where there's an indication of harm, but it's not confirmed. But it's important that we finish that exercise, because that in turn then allows us to identify, because we're dealing with relatively small numbers, and it's quite nuanced in terms of being able to identify where harm could have taken place. That in turn then will allow us to design the mechanism to look at the remaining calls. But it's important to note that of those 21,000 incidents, there was 6,000 of them we have looked at. 13,000 out of those 21,000 incidents related to traffic hazards or panic alarms, both of which have a very high cancellation rate, and either the traffic hazard was dealt with at the time or not. So we expect there to be a much lower conversion rate, I suppose, so to speak, into incidents of concern. But really, we have to go through it in that sequence, because we need to understand the pattern of these incidents, how they translate into ones of harm, before we can try then to automate the process of looking at all of those other 14,000 priority 1 incidents, and then potentially all, or a sample at least, of the 200,000 incidents that were cancelled. And again, no indication that those 200,000 incidents were cancelled incorrectly, but we do want to sample those to see if either they were miscategorised or if they were again cancelled incorrectly.
And that has yet to start.
Well, no, it's all part of the same process. We've always said we're going to conclude the work on the high priority incidents first, before we start to look at the next set of the 200,000 in particular. But there has been an assessment done or a sample done on the 20,000. We just haven't had a chance, because we're focused on producing the data on the high priority incidents. But there has been an assessment done on a number of the other 14 or so thousand. That data just hasn't been amalgamated or hasn't been combined yet.
And the next step, which is, as I understand it, this keyword search, when is that starting?
It'll start once we finish. So the priority is to finish the 3,000. Then after that, to report on the data that we have, or on the reviews that have been done on the other 14,000 priority incidents. Not all of them have been reviewed, but a significant number have, certainly a representative number have been reviewed. Then once we've done those 2 exercises, that in turn then will inform, which will largely be an automated review of a sample of the other 200,000. But there's no point in starting an exercise to look at 200,000 in an automated way until we've concluded the other previous steps, and that's something we've always articulated, and I think is reflected in Mr. Penman's report as well.
I was just going to say that your methodology was favourably commented on by Mr. Penman, but obviously we also want to see progress. So, if I could come to, am I okay on time? If I could come to recommendation 10, which Deputy Commissioner just touched on a moment ago in relation to the use of the Intel or and the use of that categorisation to incorrectly record intelligence, and the response of the Gardaí in their most recent response to us is that that can only be considered once the current examination is concluded, and we're a little bit perplexed to understand why that can't be done sooner, why it's waiting for the examination to be concluded. And I presume you're talking about Mr. Penman's examination there, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, we're talking about our own
your own examination.
Our own examination, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
but the recommendation is accepted.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your own examination, you know, how long is that going to take, and why can this not be this part of your review not take place simultaneously?
Well, in the first instance, Andrew has just gone through the complexity of the layers of examination that have to take place, and I suppose our objective from the very outset was from taking a risk approach to this, and from looking at it from the victim's perspective. So. I mean, it is going to be done. It's just that it hasn't started yet, really.
Okay. Is there any danger that there is possible urgent intelligence that was incorrectly categorised and that might be lost?
Well, I suppose I can't say for definite, but I would be fairly confident that there isn't. I mean, this essentially is information that that might come in, that comes in from the public, but it's usually of a very low level, or it could be about anything from cows wandering or cattle wandering to accidents to whatever else, and it's a means of recording that type of information. And some work is being done in terms of the categories of that intelligence, so that I suppose it's looking to the future really and making sure that it has a more definitive role or more definitive place or description in the context of CAD. But intelligence per se, there is a different system in the organisation for capturing intelligence in terms of, information about a crime or whatever else. That would not fit into this category. It would be recorded separately. And then, of course, we have our own CHIS, our human source CHIS management system as well, which is a formal process of intelligence gathering across the organisation.
Okay, and just finally then, the 13th recommendation was that the Gardaí should build on the learnings from the CAD review and develop comprehensive strategy and roadmap for national communication, command and control. And the Garda response is that the recommendation is accepted and forms part of our ongoing governance and continued work in the area of call taking and call handling. That response just... it seems that there isn't maybe a targeted response for the development of comprehensive strategy and roadmap for the National Communication Command and Control. So I just wonder, should that response be more targeted rather than forming part of your overall ongoing governance in the area of call taking and handling?
So in response to that particular question, what I will say is, in terms of CAD 2, we see that as our huge opportunity to bring our call taking and call handling and communication into the current day and the current requirements. And we have and will continue to build in the learnings from the CAD review, which have been extensive, and that has fed in already. So so I think that's where the reference to the current governance, etc. Like, it's a constant learning that will fall into our, will inform the communications strategy into the future. So, I mean, as we've said at many of the meetings, both in public and in private, like, the CAD review has shone a light in how we answer calls for service from the public, and we have learned a huge amount in terms of our own processes and procedures, and indeed failings. So I just absolutely can assure you that we will have a very robust communication strategy encompassing all of those factors at the end of this.
And can you tell us what that might look like, what's going to be different at this stage? Just a very broad outline.
So I suppose what is going to be different really is the first of all, CAD 2 is a very different system. It's very modern. It's much more intuitive, and our management reports are going to be much more detailed, frequent, and I suppose robust. So that will inform our governance, our supervision, and will aid our governance and supervision. In addition to that, then, I suppose the CAD review has identified, significant failures in terms of our response, and I suppose will form the learnings from that will form part of how we're going to approach our communications, and that intrusive management of our communications, and also inform our understanding of what the supervisory requirement has to be into the future, and the professionalisation of all of that. So I suppose, again, going back to what I said, we're coming from a much more informed position. It was going to be informed anyway, but, prior to the CAD review, with the building of CAD 2 and the procurement of CAD 2, but we're in a much more enlightened place now in the context of what we know, in terms of what can go wrong, what could go wrong, and what we need to do to prevent that.
Specifically, can you point to any, say, even one example of something that you've learned from the CAD review that you're now saying, right, in our communication strategy or in the implementation of CAD 2, we need X, Y, or Z because we know there were failings before. So can you give me a tangible example of something you've learned from the review of CAD that you're now applying to CAD 2 or your communication strategy for the future?
Yeah, so one really tangible thing, which on the face of it might seem a very basic thing, but it's the importance of quality assurance in terms of our call taking and our response to same.
I have no further questions.
One other one, actually. So just one other one, Shalom, and that is that, one, again, as identified by Mr. Penman, and we were already aware of it, one of the issues with the existing CAD system is that it's just a dispatch system. It has no real decision support capabilities, and that's a very major component, and has been reinforced, I suppose, by the consequences of the CAD review, is the need for decision support to be built into CAD 2, so that it will advise the call takers and the dispatchers that they can't cancel an incident, that they have to go through kind of additional steps, and the ability to get around the system, I suppose, will be much more limited. And that's something we already have to great effect in the likes of kind of Pulse. I mentioned the victim offender relationship earlier on, where these kind of mandatory changes in decision supports and systems dramatically improve both the quality of the service and the quality of the data recording. So that's a very major learning, I suppose, a reinforcement of a learning in CAD 2.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Undoubtedly, CAD 2 will be a significant improvement, but it wasn't the technology in CAD 1 that caused these difficulties to arise in the first instance, and we all know that, so it's important to say it. I think it's really important that We have further engagements between the authority and the Garda Síochána in relation to your response in respect of the recommendations, a welcome response. The acceptance of virtually all of them is important, as I said at the beginning, was the Commissioner's acceptance on behalf of the organisation of the findings. But I think we need to satisfy ourselves collectively so that we can satisfy the public that when a recommendation is said to be completed, that it actually is fully integrated into the system. And in respect of one of the recommendations, recommendation 11, just to note that the authority is even more strongly of the view that it should be implemented than the Garda Síochána is strongly of the view that it should be modified to the point of being not implemented. And that's the one in respect of the involvement by the nature of the involvement of the authority in the future evaluation of this issue. But that I think we will leave for another day. As I said at the outset of this item, important work has been done. We know, despite all of the difficulties that we identified at various stages last year, we know that from the very beginning the significance of this was recognised, and we know the effort that was being made to deal with it. The importance is that it is brought to a conclusion on all fronts as quickly as possible, not to get rid of it, on the contrary, so as to provide the absolute assurance that can be as absolute an assurance as can be given to the public and to any individual in the public who has occasion to be in circumstances that warrants making an emergency call to 999. So we will discuss separately with you how we can proceed on some of these fronts. And as I said again, we hope that not earlier than the end of March, but we hope that in April we will have reached the point where Derek Penman is in a position to listen to some calls, and that we can bring that phase of it to a conclusion as well, in the interests of everybody concerned. I'm very conscious that we're overrunning, bad chairing, but important topics nonetheless. There were 3 other issues, and if you would bear with us and we could just overrun for a brief period beyond our 5 o'clock scheduled end. And the first was in relation to public order, and briefly from Stephen Martin.
Commissioner, in April 19, the Garda Inspector report into public order made 19 recommendations. The context of that was some difficulties at Síochána and North Frederick Street. That report was described as a forward-looking examination. Some 2 years later, just over a year ago, in fact, the Rise Up protest in Grafton Street occurred. You have carried out an internal review into the policing at Grafton Street. Can I say at the outset, it's really good to carry out an internal review and to examine yourselves in that way. However, it does present a difficult read, and there are a number of challenges presented in it in relation to planning, the sharing of intelligence, the involvement of specialist advice, criminal justice preparations. So we're another year further ahead, some 3 years since the original report. So I have 2 initial questions for you. One, can you assure us that the significant learning from this latest report will be embraced and acted upon? And secondly, we were somewhat surprised to see that the terms of reference for this report did not include the role of command or leadership in terms of the planning or the policing of the event on the day. Would you comment on that and perhaps consider looking at that, because it seems to be a very surprising absence?
Well, just in terms of the disorder, well, in terms of just the policing of the protests last February and March, and so like no later than a week after this event, there was a further protest in Cork, and in effect, a lot of the learning that we'd taken from the events in Dublin. We applied no later than 7 days later, and certainly they were applied then also then in Dublin on the 17th of March. So there was a prompt response. There was also, in effect, the lessons learned process that was undertaken by AC Hillman then as well, and that was an examination of a whole series of factors, including face-to-face interviews and feedback from various ranks on the day itself. But I have to say, on the day, and I was present myself, there was very visible leadership on the ground. Both Chief Superintendents, North and South Central, were on the ground together with superintendents and inspectors. There was very active supervision of what was happening in terms of the protest and how it evolved between Grafton Street and then back across to the GPO, and then how it developed thereafter. It was a very dynamic situation that kept on evolving, and there was, in the day, I can't remember the number of arrests that were made, but there was significant criminal justice intervention in terms of the disorder we faced. So certainly then we wanted to do a lessons learned. It was clear that there was some discontent even being expressed on the day in terms of information available, and so we did a lessons learned in terms of that. So I think we were open to what we saw and reflected very quickly on it, because what we could see in Dublin, we immediately applied then the following Saturday in Cork, and then subsequently, as I say, in Dublin on the 17th of March, when we faced what we thought would be a very large-scale protest, but we put in specific tactics then to manage those, at the time, protests which were outside the COVID regulations. So I think overall then, just in terms of the leadership of these things, I do think that's tied in then to our command structure. That's tied in then to the gold, silver, bronze. Some of the training around gold, silver, bronze has been delayed for prospective commanders. Some gold training has been delivered, but silver training is still outstanding. That's to be delivered this year. So there is a training deficit, and that would be that's recognised in terms of the overall command structure. So we were aware of that in any case there. But I don't think it was deliberately that we left that leadership piece out. But Paula did the work, and I know she did interview and speak to many of the commanders that were on the ground at the time as well.
Okay. You mentioned Gold Command, and obviously one of the principles there is it's a functional role, best skilled and occupationally competent and operationally competent individuals who don't always necessarily be the people in geographic ownership. One of the strong cultural aspects, might say, of the Garda Síochána is that sense of geographic ownership. As you roll out the vision that AC Hillman has explained to us in terms of the national approach, there could be tension between that vision and that geographic ownership culture. Would you care to comment on that, and just the sense of empowerment that the national lead, for example, will have in trying to overcome that potential cultural impediment?
Well, firstly, and I think in any case it's been acknowledged, this very strong culture of geographic ownership in terms of those who are responsible for the policing of a certain area is actually a very positive thing, that they do take that connection very seriously, and that is a very positive element which overall contributes a lot to the performance of the organisation and that connection to the community. So it's not something that we seek to diminish. What we do have to recognise is that increasingly all sorts of events in terms of critical incidents, and that might be public order, but indeed firearms incidents, require specialised command and control. The public order one in particular would be of the view that certainly the regional ACs should be qualified as gold commanders, and we would seek to do that, but also that those who would take on divisions, so the chief supers and we'll have 19 of those, that the vast majority of those would also be qualified as gold as well, and therefore could act as silver. So I'm not saying it's an absolute requisite, that qualification, to take on a geographical command or one of those, the major geographical command, but it sort of feels like it to me that one, there's a fair understanding of gold, silver, bronze, and therefore then commanders can slot in and out to help each other should there be protracted or long-term incidents, and even when one considers a presidential visit, which is 24/7 for maybe 3-4 days, we'll have to be able to do that anyway. So as we professionalise around this and identify, as you say, the functional command, then we have to act then accordingly. So, but I'm very anxious not to lose that geographic connection as well, and we all understand it's so important in terms of service delivery and that local delivery as well.
Yeah, and clearly in identifying the geographic aspect of the culture, there are many positives to it, as you've highlighted, but it's ensuring that when you're embracing functional command, the two complement each other as opposed to rub up against each other. But thank you for that answer. Final question on this issue. We know that you, as part of your provision, that you have armed support units that you will deploy to a public order instance that are unplanned or spontaneous outside of Dublin. This, when we've considered it, it did raise a range of human rights considerations in relation to just ensuring a graduated and flexible approach in deploying people who's primarily trained to engage in Article 2 threat, suddenly being deployed into a situation that may well fall beneath that threshold, but they're equipped to deal with an Article 2 threat. So probably one of culture and service directions, but just in terms of those, just some human rights considerations to ensure that the approach by those officers is graduated and proportionate. Would you care to comment on that or provide some reassurance, please?
I want to come back just around the very specifics of that, because my understanding is where Armed Support Unit have been deployed where we have a public order concern. It's the nature of the public order concern which may have involved the use of weapons and, in effect, factions attacking each other with weapons, and that would have then required perhaps the Armed Support Unit to be able to deal with those individuals who were, armed and dangerous with offensive weapons, or indeed live firing weapons or shotguns. So, but I just want to come back to the specifics of that, because Armed Support Unit is for a specific purpose, and I wouldn't be for like they've a hybrid approach into public order. It's only specifically where we've concerns around people. Or intelligence, should I say, around individuals going to events and being, in effect, already armed and carrying offensive weapons, and obviously intend to resort to extreme violence.
Okay, well, clarification on that point would be very helpful, Commissioner, because that wasn't our understanding, but let's seek the clarification.
Yeah, well, because there's a bit of oil and water here. Firearms officers are for firearms incidents. Public order is a different thing.
Okay, we'll look forward to that clarification. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Stephen. Then we have two brief items, or two items which we will deal with briefly, not necessarily the same thing. The first is the issue of the succeeded in closing my DNA, but is the DNA, the submission of DNA samples to FSI Forensic Science Ireland. We've had multiple discussions on this over the last 3 years, and I hope that this evening will give us the reassurance that everything has been resolved and all is functioning properly. But Paul McGeehan will open the box.
Just very briefly, so yes, that's a summary, I suppose, of the DNA issue, but we did receive a review, I think, undertaken by Assistant Commissioner O'Driscoll in relation to this in September 2020, but it was a draft review, or that's the way it was characterised, and we haven't heard anything since. So I'm just wondering what status that review has at this stage. You know, is it now a completed document? If it is, can we see it? And I suppose the second point is, are you reassured, either Assistant Commissioner O'Driscoll or Commissioner, that the sorts of issues that caused our concern and your own concern in relation to the issue of DNA samples have been addressed?
Okay, well, what I'd say is that the review arose out of the outcome of a thematic review done by our Professional Standards Unit, and that their report had 39 recommendations attached to it. So we're working through those 39 recommendations, and we have provided an update to the Professional Standards Unit in terms of where we are in relation to each of those. First of all, we have been impacted to some extent by the COVID pandemic in relation to handling of exhibits and the capacity of FSI to receive those exhibits, and we're working through those issues, which will be greatly assisted, by the way, when FSI opens a new facility, I believe, later this year. A number of developments arising from the review that I did, and I suppose the most important is that where we suspected that there may be any wrongdoing involved and maybe disciplinary action to be taken, those matters were handed over to our Internal Affairs Department, and they are working on that and working through that. The exact status of where they are, I am not sure, but they were provided with the information gleaned in the course of the review that I had charge of, and those actions will be brought forward. In my particular review, there was a recommendation that a new code of practice be prepared, and there was a code of practice prepared pursuant to, I think it's section 157 of the relevant Act of 2014. That code of practice goes to the Minister for Justice for approval once the Commissioner has approved it, and is then published. We now have a new draft code of practice which will go to the Executive in the month of March, and will then, subject to approval of the Commissioner, be forwarded to the Minister and will be published. It is a code of practice which includes basically what we would in other circumstances describe as a procedural document. So it is updated to take account of the outcome of the review that I undertook and of the recommendations made by our Professional Standards Unit. And we have a plan in place to increase the number of samples taken under particular headings without going into the detail of it, which was postponed because it wasn't appropriate to be taking those sorts of samples during COVID. And so we anticipate, following the approval of the Code of Practice, if it is approved and issued, that the 1st of April would potentially be the date that we will then have an enhanced campaign to ensure a greater level of submission of samples under particular headings, and to the Code of Practice designed to ensure that those problems that have arisen in the past will not arise into the future.
Okay, can I just ask, and I don't want to labour this point, I know we're under pressure for time, but I think in the latest version of the report that we got in September 2020, there were still investigations ongoing into, I think, 469 samples that had gone missing or couldn't be accounted for. Are those then the things that you're talking about that are still being investigated in terms of internal disciplinary matters?
Yeah, the percentage of those, or the number of those where we weren't in a position to resolve to our satisfaction, they will have progress to Internal Affairs, who have for some time now been working on that data and will undoubtedly have results which wouldn't necessarily be conveyed to me, but would be available, will be available obviously in due course in terms of an assessment of the outcome. In other words, the number who were disciplined or.
And we can maybe request that, but can I just to close this off, the draft report that we got in September 2020, is that in effect the final version? So that has led to, or is leading to, this new code of practice that you've talked about. Are we going to see an absolutely final version of that report, or is that what we're going to have?
Perhaps the final report would include the data that I refer to when the disciplinary process has concluded. That we can combine that information and include in it, the detail of the new code of practice and other relevant information. We are in a better position in terms of moving forward in our relationship with the FSI and the delivery of exhibits in circumstances where a state-of-the-art centre is, if I'm not mistaken, ahead of plan, maybe even in terms of being delivered in Back Weston, I think is the location, not on the outskirts of Dublin.
But you're satisfied, sorry, Assistant Commissioner, that if this code of practice is adopted and implemented, that the sorts of issues that this review highlighted will not recur?
Yes, and among the recommendations that have been implemented include a necessity to review issues relating to DNA in PAF meetings at a local level and the highlighting of DNA-related issues. Also, the investigation management system, which was delayed, the rollout of which was delayed as a consequence of the pandemic, also will have inbuilt into it a monitoring mechanism in those investigations that will be recorded on the system to monitor the taking of samples, to ensure that the taking of samples has taken place where it is appropriate, and to ensure the follow-up that is necessary arising from the taking of the sample.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hold on to the third item.
Good morning. Sorry, you're on the cross-border issue.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, Chair. I'm there and covering his cross-border immigration checks, and we've been dealing with Garda Síochána for a couple of years in relation to this matter. And we've received a report from Assistant Commissioner O'Driscoll in response to a letter from the Chief Executive, which gave a very broad, very extensive address of the issue of the legislative background, the organisational structure, the approach that's adopted to immigration checks within the country. One of the things that is still an issue for me, certainly, and for the authority, is it's something that's been raised with is in relation to the potential or the possibility for racial profiling at such checks. Now, what I'm interested in, perhaps very briefly, is if you could, one, confirm that the various checks that do take place are always on the basis of intelligence received, or whether, in fact, you do random checks in relation to buses or trains moving between the jurisdictions, and that any checks that do take place by GNIB personnel are on the basis of random assessment of people there, or is there some other methodology by which it's determined by the individual officers who or in what manner people may be checked?
Okay. Immigration checks are done in compliance with the Immigration Act of 2004 in particular, but there is other relevant legislation, and it distinguishes the arrival of people at approved ports of entry to the state.
I'm comfortable with that, and you give them excellent material in relation to that, and I certainly understand it as a consequence of that. But in terms of the practicality of the manner in which the Gardaí engage with people on buses or trains, and when they actually board those buses and trains to undertake immigration checks, How do they determine the individuals? How do they identify the individuals who are going to be subject to those checks?
In that report is reference to the Garda National Immigration Bureau information system, which is a system that is standalone and separate to the PULSE system, in which information relevant to the immigration control process is recorded.
Does that mean then, Assistant Commissioner, that you will always, Garda, or as a matter of course, will operate on the basis of information that they have got, and that they will be identifying or targeting specific individuals on those means of transport?
Well, there's a unit which is described as a border unit, which is in Dundalk, and that unit will do tests, but it will use that information coming from the GNIB information system. I see the report, for example, at my level every day, telling me the number of people who have been detected unlawfully entering the state and the jurisdiction from where they have travelled. And we find that a significant proportion of those people who arrive at Dublin Airport whose entry is refused but who are allowed to enter for other reasons may attempt to enter the UK. So we see the nature of the immigration patterns and we react to them.
And you were good enough to give us the numbers on that, but if I might concentrate again purely on the cross-border, so we're talking about buses and trains. And is it on the basis, the people that the Gardaí, when they board those and they question certain people in relation to the documentation that they have, do they take a random approach, or is it always based on information that you've got?
Well, it'll be based on information and also the availability of resources. Perhaps if we had more resources, we could check more trains and buses. But the people who they will be examining, which is the word used in the Act, will be those who are required to have a permission to enter the state. Because of the common travel area that operates between Ireland and the United Kingdom, many people who travel are not required to present to an immigration officer. So it is those people who are required to enter, who are visa required, and therefore the focus will be on identifying.
The challenge for you is to identify such people, and I'm just wondering, do you have names? Are you clear that these are the people who are actually travelling on the day, and that you're specifically boarding the means of transport with a view to engaging and to ensure such persons don't enter the jurisdiction, or is it possibly less random than that?
Well, it'll first of all depend on the availability of resources. There was a unit of 2 and 12 at one stage, and more recently that has reduced. So they can only do a certain amount of checks. They will then be aware of the particular nationalities, for example, from time to time. That will be a focus of attention. We have discovered a number of facilitators of illegal immigration in the recent past because of our exchange of information between ourselves and the UK Border Force, who work very closely with us. And through that engagement, for example, we identify the flows that need to be focused on. And that includes, by the way, preventing smuggling, but also human trafficking. And particularly the smuggling of children.
Did I understand you correctly? Did I understand you correctly then, Assistant Commissioner, that you were mentioning that you're focusing on nationalities, or that there are particular nationalities who perhaps under threat or in difficult situations. So is it nationalities you focus, or is it individuals, or is it random?
The Immigration Act requires us to focus on nationalities because it is discriminatory in nature. It says people who come from a particular jurisdiction don't require a visa, others do. And therefore our focus is on the countries where the government, and particularly the Minister for Justice, has imposed a visa requirement. And that will change from time to time. So, for example, prior to the accession states, as they were known, joining the EU, we were stopping people coming from the Czech Republic and from countries
The only difficulty that, and my apologies for extending this, the only difficulty I have, or the challenges that in Garda Síochána might have, if you focus in on nationalities, that's where the potential or the charge against the potential danger of what has been communicated to us of the possibility of profiling.
Well, it is a challenge, and as a person who worked in immigration, I know the difficulties involved. So, for example, when we saw the outcome of the referendum in relation to the Irish-born child, as we sat in our office, we said to each other, this is going to produce very difficult situations in terms of removing people from this jurisdiction. That was an inevitable outcome of a government decision, but we who are charged with enforcing immigration control have to adhere to the legislation that is currently in place. It's not a question of having a preference in relation to a particular nationality or not.
And I don't wish to extend the questioning. I really don't wish to extend the questioning further. But there is that concern.
Indeed,
it has been there, and you will be aware of it. That there are racial profiling practices.
If I may, maybe give some encouragement or assistance in this matter. We are reviewing currently all the immigration-related instructions that issue to the organisation, and taking on board those sort of criticisms and questions, legitimate questions that have been asked. First of all, the question of transparency does arise, and we see that maybe we need to explain to others how we go about our business in a way that might be more appreciated. But we also need to explain what we are tackling in terms of the nature of the illegal immigration that takes place, some of which involves exploitation of people who are vulnerable, who are coming from other jurisdictions. So when we have the review of our legislation done, we will ensure that, our instruction, we will ensure it takes into account our ethics code, that it takes into account human rights related issues, to perhaps provide a clearer instruction for those who are tasked with enforcing immigration controls, and a better understanding for those who may be subject of those checks.
Thanks, Assistant Commissioner. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Rowling, and thank you, Assistant Commissioner O'Driscoll. If there is no other question, that brings us to the end of today's meeting. It has been a very welcome return to what we just know as normality, and maybe our version of normality will change as we go through the months ahead of us. But it was really nice to be able to meet in person, and together with you and your colleagues, Commissioner, in person today at this meeting. And as we hope that we are moving out of the last phase of the health emergency, I think it's also appropriate to mark the extent to which the Garda Síochána contributed to the national effort in relation to this. And as I've said on a number of occasions before, where, if I may use the phrase, ahead of the posse in its response when this awfulness first emerged a little over 2 years ago. And it's proper to record that and record the appreciation, not only of the authority, but the appreciation of the public, which was so apparent to the authority in its outreach work over the last 2 years. And finally, we know that there will be a number of departures over coming months from the Assistant Commissioner rank in the organisation. And the first person to leave will have gone before the next authority meeting, and that's Assistant Commissioner Barry O'Brien, who made many appearances at private and public meetings, committee and authority, over the last 6 years. And I just wanted to note that, and to wish him well in the future. So thank you very much to you, Commissioner, and your colleagues, and thank you to our own colleagues, and we look forward to many more meetings, perhaps even when the wearing of masks may be optional, at least. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.